Goeiemorgen, Sluitlanders. Today is a very lovely sunny day, and we're very thankful for all the rain that we've received here in the Karoo. Today we have a very special guest named Faust. And welcome, Faust. If you would just share us a bit who you are, where you are involved politically, what is your ideology, and what is your hope for the Netherlands, where you come from?
Right. Well, that's a lot of things to just rattle off at a go. Where I stand politically is, nationalistic, conservative, I'd say. Greater Dutch nationalism, because I believe in a united Dutch identity, which also includes the Flemish, to an extent the Wallonians, and also, of course, South Africans, Boeren especially. And traditional conservative values, I don't think I have to illustrate, although these days sometimes you do have to explain those things, but traditional conservative position mostly. But I am also very interested in technology. So I take a lot of archaeofuturist ideas. I have 2 YouTube channels, and on my English language YouTube channel, I talk a lot about things like technology influencing society, how this will influence developments also in our countries, and how this will influence nationalism through, for example, genetic pressures and CRISPR and AI and these sort of things. I talk a lot about economics because that's where my background actually is in. I used to be involved with a few underground groups in the Netherlands. I helped set up a group called Erkenbrand, which became pretty infamous because there were a few scandals involving us in the national media. These days, I mostly run online content. I have a Dutch YouTube channel called Tietze Bazuin and a arts magazine. And these are mostly focused on presenting ideas to the general populace, trying to explain nationalistic and conservative ideas in sort of easy to understand ways to the general population, to educate them. And to try and convince them that our positions are the right ones. And I've started doing that because there isn't very much online in the Netherlands. There's really almost no one making content. There's a relatively decently organized movement on the ground, more so in Flanders than in the Netherlands. But there are groups and there is activism. I mean, Voorpost, which I think is also active in South Africa, does a lot of things here. And you've got our own local identitarians and so on. But there was really no content online. And one thing I think we have learned from the Americans is online works to inform people, online works to reach people. And since that hasn't been happening, I decided to focus on that. So yeah, that's what I do, more or less.
Wow, well, it's actually true. You know, we don't really find much content on the Netherlands, or especially conservative-minded, nationalistic ideology people. So that's it's great that you're part of the whole movement for nationalism. And you say you have a background in economics. Can you elaborate just a little bit on what your background is specifically and what your stance is on how the Netherlands have become very communistic, not directly stating that they're communist, but in the way that they handle things and their structures?
Well, I studied economics at university, so that's my background in it, bachelor's. I don't think the Netherlands can be called communistic, really. It's more neoliberal. It's the general worldwide trend I see is that socially we are more moving towards what you might call communistic ideals, egalitarianism, humanism, and so on. But in the terms of economics, rampant capitalism is absolutely the norm everywhere. And this seems to be sort of the devil's bargain that people have made in modern politics, where the left can do whatever it wants on social topics. They can promote all kinds of crazy things like transgenderism. But if they start talking about maybe more welfare, or they get ignored, then they have absolutely no power. So I wouldn't say that it's become a communistic, it's neoliberal. The Netherlands' position specifically is, of course, we've always been a trading nation. So for us, I often say that whoever has power tends to be in favor of free trade, and those who don't have power tend to be in favor of protectionism. So back when we were having trade wars with the English were in favor of Marktklausel and protectionist policies, and we were in favor of free trade trade with mare liberum in Hugo Grotius. And then when the English became the dominant world sea power, they became in favor of free trade because, if you have access to free markets, if you have the economic power to control the shipping lanes and so on, like the Americans do today, then free trade is good for you. And otherwise, you want protectionism. So I think, considering the Americans are dominant worldwide with the dollar system, the petrodollar and so on, Wall Street finance, neoliberalism is going to continue to be the model for the coming few decades still. And communism will be a social phenomenon.
And what do you think economically? So I spoke to someone, and you have to correct me if they gave me something incorrect. I spoke to someone in the Netherlands about a month ago, and they said that apparently the Netherlands wants even more, basically to build more homes, to develop more homes, but they want to use like land that was meant for farming. And their plan to handle this issue is to just import more food. Firstly, is that true? And secondly, what effect will this have economically? Because the Netherlands will be completely dependent on other countries.
It's not a stated policy as such, but that is the result of what is currently happening. So we've had a housing shortage for quite some time, at least a decade by now, and that has a lot to do with migration. We have a net migration of about 55,000 a year, incredible ranges of growth, and the Netherlands is already the most densely populated country in Europe. So we need about 1 million new houses, and so one of the other policies has been to disown farmers, but through environmental regulation, make it more and more difficult for farmers to operate their businesses. Restrictions on CO2, but particularly NOx gases, are used as an excuse to force them to shut down or lower their production. And then that land gets bought up, yes. In fact, there's this massive trend. There was a story in the news yesterday, Bill Gates buying up massive tracts in the United States. So this is more of a worldwide trend, I think, that has to do with the destruction of small business and middle class towards centralization of economics. But in the Netherlands specifically, yes, there is this policy of sort of harassing farmers, trying to shut them down, and then taking that land to build new homes on. As for economic dependence, well, currently we are per capita the second or third largest agricultural producer in the world. But this I'm not sure that this is necessarily good for us. Of course, we're reliant in terms of our production, but a lot of our production is in specialized items like flours, meats, cheese, milk, which is meant for export. So we can safely reduce our agricultural sector somewhat and still be autarkic in our food production. But it, of course, will hurt the economy because it's a massive export sector. It's a cash flow for us.
And what is the pressure on the middle class specifically now in the Netherlands specifically? Because in South Africa, to give you an idea of the pressure on the middle class in South Africa, it's there's a lot of pressure because during the COVID-19, 42.7% of all small businesses, which is the middle class, is completely they closed their doors. And of the 42%, 99% of them applied for relief funds from the government, but they were denied because they weren't like BEE registered and they were white-owned businesses. And I'm not sure if you know about BEE, a policy institute in South Africa. It's broad-based Black economic empowerment with the intent to have more Black people in companies. So I have this idea of, because white people are only 8% of the population, they only have to have 8% of the jobs. So even if you are a top student at a high school and you apply for admission at a university, they're also only allowed to take a certain amount of white people in. So we have that. So there's a lot of middle class, and So what can you tell us about the Netherlands, the middle class? What pressures are there on them? And how about, just answer that first, and then I'll ask you another question.
I have heard of these quota systems in South Africa. I didn't know it was called that. Well, the general trend, of course, is towards a lease-based economy. So one of the things that gets ignored in this story very much is the monetary policies that we've been conducting for the last 10, 12 years in the West, where the euro, but specifically the dollar, has become incredibly cheap. This has become a motivator to try and find any kind of asset or revenue stream that isn't in dollars, anything to keep value. So this is one of the reasons, for example, housing in the Netherlands is very expensive. There's a huge speculative bubble in the property market because our housing market is also open to the internet, to international investors. But it's a trend in the West all over. And you're seeing this, for example, with less and less people buy their phones. They roll over registrations and they pay off a phone on loan. They do this with cars. They don't buy cars, they lease cars. We're seeing this in the Netherlands now with bicycles. We're seeing this with scooters. You lease all of these things. You never buy any property. This has a lot to do with the fact that the currency is so cheap and that anything is an asset. You don't want dollars. If you can buy a bicycle as a big company, then you'll buy a bicycle and rent that out because it's better than having fiat reserves. And this, of course, means that a lot of the small businesses are competed out of the market. Every small crook is being taken over by bigger and bigger corporations. Think of Uber, for example, in the taxi market. And it's all very centralized. From especially the United States. Think of tech companies as well. Think of how social media is very centrally controlled. And then this COVID thing has really put this into a very fast stream, because a lot of these small horeca, we call it hotel, restaurant, cafes, so hospitality, have suffered massively. I think about 50% of them will be eliminated. And what we're seeing there is, for example, websites start taking over, thuisbezorgd, for example, and you can order centrally. And I'm seeing now where caterers are going onto this website. So big companies who have, big halls where they can mass produce food, and they're just taking over from small restaurants and cafes. So there's that trend as well. So like I say, it has a lot to do with monetary policy at the foundation of it. But then this COVID thing is used as a regulus where they can grab even more power.
Yes. In South Africa, we also saw that it progressed the agenda of the overt communist party, the current ruling government in South Africa, and they also openly admit that the agenda is the National Democratic Revolution, which entails the complete destruction, removal of all state enterprises, and basically switching them with democratic enterprises. So we saw like a radical, drastic change during COVID to progress this agenda, and it was of course used with COVID. How that the average Dutch person that was influenced by COVID, would you say that the political ideas were influenced as well? Do you think there's a lot of people that's starting to say, but this I don't agree with this, or would you say it's not really like it had an effect?
Not enough. The current ruling party, the VVD, is massively up in the polls because a lot of people say, it's so important to manage this crisis properly and we need to stick with the current authorities. It have resulted in some protests. For example, last year, 2 years ago by now, in 2019, there were a lot of farmer protests. They blocked the roads with their trackers, and they went to the capital and protested. And this was quite impactful in society. This was a huge debate. But they used the COVID excuse to shut down those protests as well. Cafe holders and restaurant managers and so on are also protesting against the government. But again, this is not enough to really cause a shift in thinking in society. And unfortunately, a lot of the people whose jobs are not affected by it, and in the Netherlands, there's quite a lot of jobs that are in finance or in the international maritime sector or management and so on, or in the international court in The Hague, who just continue their operations. They work from home. They're not affected. and they instead shifted to supporting the government policy. So unfortunately, I think no, it hasn't shifted thinking very much, unfortunately.
And what would you say is the future of private ownership and private property basically in Netherlands? Because this adds to neoliberalism and communism as well. In South Africa, for example, I don't know how much you know about the land expropriation without compensation.
A little bit.
So it was published at the ending of last year and it's open for like public comment. But they're quiet. They're a bit quiet about it. They're very smart on how they handle this. But specifically, it changed from the 1975 bill, and it basically they shifted it, and it's now expropriation of all types of property. So it's pension funds as well, investment funds, private property of all sorts. They also said that the municipality would have the right to say, oh, that house wasn't used for the last 3 years, so we're expropriated. So that has a very bad economical effect on South Africa, especially for investors, and a lot of other aspects as well. I mean, if you just start with the statistics, you can just go on and go on and go on. But my question is, what is the future for the Dutch private ownership in the Netherlands?
Well, I think this is a worldwide trend. What you're describing sounds like using a sledgehammer, where in the rest of the world they're being a bit more clever and using a scalpel and using central banking and using monetary policy, and they're doing it a lot more subtly. Whereas what it sounds like in South Africa, they're just being very blunt about it. We actually used to have this law where if you didn't use your property for things, you would be expropriated. But actually, our Liberal Party made that illegal in 2011. The worldwide trend is destroying the middle class, because I am of the opinion that nationalism is the ideology of the middle class. The nation state is the protection the middle class has against international exploitation and ruthless elites and so on. And if the middle class has money, then the middle class can invest in part of their interests. They become too much of a wild card to control centrally from the perspective of the current political paradigm. So I think that there's an active policy to try and destroy middle class and make everyone just a consumer entity. And I think the United States is pretty much where you have to look to for where this trend is, and then particularly, for example, Los Angeles, California, where property prices are so high you're always renting, and you're forced to use public transport because cars are banned because of environmental regulations or other such measures. It's all done a little bit more subtly, like when it's done the way you're describing in South Africa, it causes resistance because people can visibly see someone advocating against their interests and advocating to take away their property and their rights. Whereas here in the West, it's just, migration, that's just a natural trend. Economics is just what it is. That's just international markets. What can you do about it? Truth is, this is of course a consequence of policy. You can set targets as an economy. If you can use protectionism, you can use your monetary policy to protect the interests of your middle class. So increasingly, I think the target is to not have a middle class anymore, not have small businesses, because they're too unpredictable in political terms.
And what do you believe, because we can see this is building up until a point where it won't be able to be kept under control. And you see it right throughout history. So the Cycloners, in light of gathering together, because the Cycloners is an emergency plan initiative, and it basically focuses on people gathering together, cooperative working, and in what light of this, what does the Netherlands have an equivalent, a Dutch equivalent to like the Cycloners initiative, in any way, just like in any equivalence to really preserve the middle class, or to preserve at least the nationalism in the country?
Not really anything as structured, grassroots as Zuidlanders. We have a few political parties who are more or less advocating for the interest of the middle of the native population, Forum for Democracy and PVV of Geert Wilders. And we still have our old-fashioned Reformed Church Calvinist party, which also advocates for that, but they're quite small. But it's only in Parliament. It's not. There's not really a cultural movement. There's not really grassroots organization supporting this. So something like Zuidlanders, which is people coming together themselves and organizing themselves, that's not really happening now.
Would you say, I actually read something interesting about the Netherlands, and this is a bit off topic, but it adds to nationalism. Muslims, they have some of the highest population of Muslims apparently. And does that influence nationalism? Do you think there's more people that would, become more nationalistic, seeing the threat of absolute cultural a switch basically of cultures, because the Muslims their population increases wildly in comparison to the Dutch people. So would you say there has been an increase in nationalism with not really?
Yeah. This is towards the right in Dutch. But from a liberal perspective, and it's been generally from a liberal perspective that, we don't want these middle-aged ideas to come back, sort of thing. We don't want women in burqas. We want to protect the gays and these sorts of things. But yeah, Islam being a very, very visible change, the burqas, the most of prayer, has really shifted the thinking of quite a lot of people, especially in the working class, who have to live around these people and they don't enjoy it. So xenophobia towards Muslims has become pretty common, and you could argue that about 25% of the population currently votes for parties who very, very openly want to remove Islam from the country as a whole.
And how do you think, at the moment of affirmative action, is there any policies instituted to reform your economy to more supply jobs for Islam?
Not specifically Islam, they just call it diversity initiatives.
Yeah, immigrants.
Immigrants, yeah, just, they have diversity policies. In fact, just yesterday our cabinet fell, the government fell. Toeslagen is welfare grants to the lower classes. And this turned out to be a huge scandal because people were fined and there were a lot of inconsistencies. And it was a big scandal because a lot of people had their lives ruined because they were not following proper bureaucratic rules. And of course, at the bottom of society, it's mostly immigrants. So this was blamed on, structural Dutch racism against immigrants. The cabinet fell over that, and the first thing they announced is that they're going to institute a staatscommissie on discrimination, which will start investigating the government and Dutch government structures over whether they're intentionally racist. And we already had diversity initiatives. For example, the police for a long time has had the policy that with equal qualifications, they'll always pick either a woman or immigrant or something that has another diverse category. And this has been more and more the case as well in the bureaucracy. So yeah, we do have these policies favoring immigrants, and this has really come over from the United States in the last 5 or so years. It's really the American ideas just being directly imported here to universities and from universities to NGOs and bureaucracy.
So what economical challenge does this bring in your country, these policies that...
Well, it means that if you are, for example, university educated white man and you have the same qualifications as a Muslim, you're not going to be selected for a job. It means that, considering they want a 50-50 distribution of CEOs to the top of companies, it means that your qualifications don't count, but your ethnicity, your background, your sex, or your gender even more so, because if you're transgender, that'll also count towards it. So yeah, it's more and more coming towards a quota system, where we're still 75 to 80% of the population native Dutch, but increasingly it is towards only 50% white men being allowed anywhere in jobs. especially high-level jobs, because no one cares if you're not street cleaner. So we've seen a few things like our public broadcasting company, the Dutch equivalent of the BBC, has about 18% of their workforce is black, which is about 3 times higher than the actual national average. And this holds for most categories. There's more homosexuals, there's more women than the national average. And this is the result of this quota system. Increasingly, white people are economically disenfranchised. But it's still in its kinderschoenen, as we say. It's not as advanced yet as in some other places, like probably South Africa, but also the United States.
Would you say that there is any chance at all for the Conservatives of Flanders and the Conservatives of the Netherlands to, in a certain way, work together? As you said, Flanders is a very big part of Netherlands, for you specifically as well. Do you think there's any chance that, as wild as it can possibly get, do you think there's any possibility that these Conservatives can ever, gather together, and that the possibility that they can have a separate state, possibly? And I have this thought for the reason that there's a lot of search for that, for the Conservatives, for the true Afrikaners to have a separate state, separate. Do you think there's a possibility of that? Do you have that in the Netherlands and in Flanders?
Well, there's a huge separatist movement in Flanders, of course. About 50% of the population there votes for parties which are nominally separatist from Belgium. But that doesn't mean they necessarily all want to join with the Netherlands. There's a big division of opinion over whether they should become an independent republic or whether they should join the Netherlands. You've got both opinions. De Groot Nederlandse Gedachte, or Republiek Vlaanderen, generally called. Opinion polling in the Netherlands shows that most Dutch people, about 80%, consider Flanders part of the Netherlands anyway and wouldn't oppose union. But it's not on any of the party's programs. As for within the current paradigm, I think there are a lot of options to work together. We've Benelux economic zone. We're both in the EU. So we have options of political cooperation, especially, for example, in the EU, where my thinking is very much that Dutch nationalists and Flemish nationalists should work more together than they do currently, because there's a little bit of cooperation. Sometimes a Flemish politician comes to speak at a Dutch event or vice versa. I always go to the IJsbak every year, which is a big nationalist event in Flanders. But the cooperation is very little still, and I think there's a lot of room to improve there, specifically within already existing frameworks, for example, within the EU. But I think that's Europe-wide. We could cooperate on a pan-European level within the EU by, for example, having all these nationalist parties coming together and trying to block policies, and because they actually do have collectively about 70 seats in the European Parliament, more than you think. So generally speaking, I think we could use a lot more cooperation, and this has a lot to do with the fact that we look way too much at America. We're way too focused on what's happening in the United States and their politics, and we're not really looking at there's a lot of people who know better how the American Congress works and how the European Union system. That's a very negative.
Independence. Do you think that they would support a movement or an idea as Brexit, but for them, exit from the European Union? Because we know it was the plan to save Europe during the hard times, but now currently, it doesn't economically always have the best effect. So do you think that they will be, pro exiting the European Union?
The nationalist parties already are. The Vlaams Belang is pro-Nexit, the PVV is pro-Nexit, Forum of Democracy is pro-Nexit. So they generally already are. And there's, among nationalists, among populists, very much this anti-EU sentiment. I agree with it and I don't agree with it to an extent, because on the one hand, the EU is a corrupt, neoliberal, progressive, which is one of the avenues that is destroying our nations and the economy, because the euro just doesn't, because the southern economies, the northern economies, there's two different conjectures. It doesn't work together. But I do think that for Europe to survive into the 21st century, 22nd century, we do need to work together as sort of a federation of states, because the United States is a power bloc, China is a power bloc, Russia is still relatively powerful, the Emirates and so on, economic powerhouses. And if we just split into 30 of 27 nation states again, we're not going to be able to challenge. What I'd like to see is a sort of 1850 of European cooperation based on the Holy Union and the Metternich system and so on. So a conservative sort of cooperation agreement, mutual defense, some cooperation, because I've read if Europe were to take the geopolitical dominant role in the world again, that would be good for culture and self-preservation of peoples and so on. So I think we do need that.
Yes. So I see that our time is nearing the end. So I'm going to basically one last idea, which is something that I really enjoy. I really enjoy, reading Dutch history as well as Afrikaans history, and I'm very proud of my history, and I'm sure that you're of yours. And I actually asked you over the phone, but to also elaborate on it. Do you feel that with our historical ties as Boere and you as also actually basically Boeren, do you think there's a possibility that we can restore bonds, and how can we support each other? There are certain barriers that makes it a bit more complex, but how do you feel that, from a Dutch perspective, how can we support each other? Because we are not close-minded to that this is just a South African issue. As you said multiple times, that it is an issue, and that's why it's important for like-minded people with the same values to basically stick together and to support each other. And it's in history, it's really interesting because a lot of Dutch men came to fight in the Boer Wars.
Yeah.
And the same, there's a lot of Boere, Afrikaans Boere, that fought with the Dutch as well, with them, not against them, with them. So how do you think we can, in a certain sense, restore this? And how can we support each other in this process?
It's a very difficult question. As you say, there's a lot of barriers, primarily the geographical one, of course. It's a bit of a distance towards South Africa. Romantically, nationalistically, historically speaking, of course, we are just one people, basically. We're tied together, and yes. I'd say we'd consider it a daughter nation, South Africa. But I have a very hard time thinking of how we can help. We're all in trouble, and yes. One of the primary causes of this is cultural and geopolitical. The dominance of United States anti-white culture has really made it very difficult to advocate, even for ourselves, let alone advocating for Afrikaans people. Because even if there were an active genocide, and to an extent there is an active genocide on Boer and Afrikaans, saying anything pro-white is so vilified in the culture that they would just get away with committing genocide, I think. And unless that culture changes, it's extremely hard to help each other. So I think the primary focus is on trying to change the culture, on changing anti-white international sort of
narratives.
Yes, narrative, yes. And that should be our primary focus, I think, because if the global culture recognizes every people has a right advocate for poor in here in the Netherlands, but we were basically told that that is such a politically popular opinion that it would be political suicide for mainstream politicians to advocate for that. And it's, of course, it's a conspiracy theory that there is genocide going on. So it's a very hard thing to advocate for. The things we can do is we can try to keep pushing our politicians to try and talk about it, at least advocate for a right of return for Afrikaans people, and to financially support in as much as possible organizations, well, like yours, like Zuidlanders, like Voorpost and Orania, Kleinfontein, these groups. But it's all small fish, I think, at the moment. And without this cultural change, without geopolitical changes in power balance, I think it's very difficult.
It is quite difficult, and we also live in a very culturally Marxist world, and it's developed so far, and the current generation has been demoralized to such a point that we receive so much information from all sides, that it's funny because in previous decades and years, many people didn't have all this information, and now we live in a world that has so much information that so little people actually truly have the true idea of what's really going on. And you
but
have
there's this saying, true control is not that you burn books, but that you make people so disinterested they won't read the books. Care. There's a lot of information out there, but there's a lot of out there. I noticed it changing more and more towards this progressive ideal, and you were just not taught a lot of things. You were not taught about different perspectives. You just got the one sort of progressive, centrist, leftist perspective on everything, this narrative. And the rest was either, oh, those are extremes we don't talk about, or that's the past and that's forgotten and that's passé, it's not happening anymore. So yeah, there's a lot of information out there, but everyone has to find it for themselves every time, and without institutions passing on knowledge, it's very hard to shift through it and find something useful. And that's why I think institution building is important. It would be great to have a nationalistic university somewhere you could attend.
Yes, there's actually in South Africa, well, it's part of the attack on the white minority, our Afrikaans universities, and this actually happened a while ago, like a couple of years ago. They're completely removing Afrikaans as a teaching language at Afrikaans universities. In a certain sense, you'll completely understand if it was like a bilingual or it was an English university, but it was Afrikaans universities established by Afrikaners for Afrikaners, and our monuments as well. So there's a lot of removal of any form of the Afrikaner in South Africa. But I'm very thankful as a young person that we have a lot of sense that, for example, we have the Voortrekker Monument, and they wanted to close the monument. And the people that own the monument had this plan that we're going to sell the monument to everyone. So by doing that, they complicated the process of closing it completely. So you could have basically bought a brick for like 100 Rand, and then so many people bought it. So, you make a plan, boer maak 'n plan. We also always have a plan. We also always try to circumvent, the circumstances and to handle that. And we still have like a couple of institutions that is very not really that nationalistic, but they're on the right way to the right idea. And
well,
we
I noticed
still
that you have a lot more like YouTube content. There's a lot more South African YouTube content than Dutch, for example, or even Flemish. And and your groups and so on. These are things we don't have in the Netherlands. So I think it's maybe because your situation is just that much worse that you need to take action that much faster, and we're still
yes, but as you said, they're using a scalpel with you and they're using a sledgehammer with us, and I think that also affects how the one that is affected, of course.
Well, I'll give you an example of exactly that. Our universities also don't touch in Dutch anymore. They teach in English. And what they say then is, this is better for your career prospect. This will help you join the international economic system better. And all big corporations use English anyway, so why would you need to learn Dutch? And with you, they probably use a bit harsher arguments. And that's the
they're very direct.
Yeah. So that's
for example, there's actually an example. Like we have this special day. It's the 16th of December, and we keep it each year. It's the day of the vow. It was the Battle of Blood River, which is an amazing story, and I'm sure you know about it. And like a while after we held the day, because we keep it, our parents keep it, our grandparents. It's a century-old day that we keep, and so firstly they changed the name to the Day of Reconciliation, and it's not a Day of Reconciliation at all. And then after they did that, the president also stated that he doesn't understand why we keep this day. We don't truly want this delusional rainbow nation concept. We don't really want that integration. We can't get through the past, and a lot of things, but still, very direct. And yet, in some things, they're so sneaky in how they progress it. For example, there's certain announcements that they make that they know will have a lot of backlash and a lot of negative attention, but they do it the times they would do it like a Friday night at 11 or at like 10 o'clock when they know there's no one watching. And usually other announcements, they will do it on a Tuesday at 7 p.m. So there's just things are handled and how things are progressing in its certain ways. But we have come to the time that it's finished. So I want to say thank you, Faust, for joining us today. And we have to keep contact, and we have to support each other, the Dutch and the Afrikaners, because, as you said, we are a daughter nation of you. And I'm very excited for the future, for the next. We as a daughter nation, we do care a lot about the nations that we come from. And we do hope that there's a lot more people that's starting to basically revert or go to nationalism. So we will support you as well.